just a flesh wound.
It's alive!
You can't handle the truth.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Say, all right.
Always live in awe of the glorious mechanism of the human body.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Soft Tissue OT podcast. My name is Jordan, the Soft Tissue OT, and today's podcast is one that's been highly requested for a while from many patients and also many clinicians out there. So pretty excited to dive into this one. But before we start off, giving a little bit of pretense, as a lot of you know, low back pain is one of the most prevalent musculoskeletal conditions worldwide, affecting people from all walks of life, right? So whether you're an athlete, a desk worker, or someone recovering from injury, you've likely been told that strengthening your core is the key to relief. But here's the catch. Not all core exercises are created equal. So for decades, researchers have studied spinal mechanics to determine the safest and most effective ways to build core stability without exacerbating pain or causing further injury. Among hundreds of exercises tested, 3 consistently emerged as the most effective for improving spinal health while minimizing compressive cost on the spine. Now, these exercises not only strengthen, but also retrain the way your body moves, and that's a critical point. So today's topic, we're diving into the McGill Big 3, a scientifically backed trio of exercises designed to enhance core stability, protect the spine, and improve movement efficiency. By the end of the podcast episode, you'll understand why these exercises work so well, how they compare to traditional quote-unquote core exercises, and how you can apply them for yourself. And let's be clear, right? The big 3 are just a very, very small part of the broader McGill method for spinal rehabilitation. So don't get that confused. This is not one and done, said all. This is a very, very minuscule part, but the big 3 has become quite popular and quite infamous. So I wanted to dive into that topic. And so we're focusing for today's podcast episode on why these 3 exercises have gained so much attention and how they compare to more traditional core exercises in terms of spinal load, but also in terms of effectiveness for spinal rehabilitation. As I alluded to before, back pain is the number 1 musculoskeletal issue in the world. It does discriminate. It affects elite athletes, office workers, parents lifting their kids, and weekend warriors alike. So the problem is that most people approach core training incorrectly. They think, if my back hurts, I need to get a stronger core, right? It's not that simple. And what do they normally do? Crunches, sit-ups, Russian twists, all exercises that can load the spine with excessive movements and compressive forces. And that may actually cause more harm than good. Now, Professor Stuart McGill, who's a leading spine biomechanist, spent decades analyzing how different movements impact the spine. He tested hundreds of core exercises using sophisticated motion capture software, force plates, and a whole bunch of fancy equipment to measure spinal loads, muscle activation, and importantly, movement efficiency. And the results? Most traditional core exercises, funnily enough, may end up increasing the risk of injury rather than preventing it. So McGill and his team asked a different question. What are the safest, most effective ways to train the core while minimizing spinal stress? Now, picture a lab filled with sensors, force plates, and people performing every kind of core exercise you can imagine, as well as different movements. McGill and his researchers meticulously examined what was happening inside the body and specifically on the spine. They looked at how much force each movement placed on the spine. They studied how well the core muscles engaged or activated, and they ran study after study, comparing exercise across different populations, people with back pain, people without back pain, elite athletes, and everyday individuals as well. And from this, 3 exercises consistently rose to the top. Now, these 3 exercises were unique because they did 3 things better than any others. Number 1, they maximize muscle activation, especially in what you call the spinal stabilizing muscles, some people call deep core muscles, and they minimize the spinal load or the compressive forces on the spine, making them a lot safer for even those with back pain or spinal issues. And lastly, which is a big key, they train movement patterns. So they basically taught people or coached people how to move efficiently without overloading the spine. Thus, the McGill Big 3 were born. And when we're referring to the big 3, we're talking about the bird dog, the side plank, and the modified curl up. Now, before we go into each exercise in detail, I'd like to add that when it comes to spinal rehabilitation, you need to understand the true role of the core, quote unquote, or the spinal muscles. And that is that their job is to stabilize the spine. and resist motion on the spine or movements or forces that can load the spine and keep the spine safe. That's their main job. Secondary is to create movement, but their main job is to stabilize and keep the spine safe. So in general, with exercises, quote unquote core exercises, I like to think of them as anti-movement training, right? So what I mean by that is what movement or what force are we training the spine or the body to resist? Okay, so keep that in mind because it becomes more relevant as we dive into these guys. And I think it's a great way to approach quote unquote core or spinal rehabilitation exercises, keeping that in mind that the true role of the core muscles is to keep the spine safe, resist movement, and resist forces. Okay, so let's dive into the first one, which is the bird dog. So the bird dog, why it works so well is that it strengthens the posterior chain, okay, while reinforcing spinal neutrality. So what we mean by that is keeping the spine in a neutral position. And it's training the body to move from your ball and socket joints of the hips and shoulders rather than creating excessive movement of the spine. It also works on your movement patterns, which again is so important, and builds your ability to resist lumbar extension and resist the lumbar spine from twisting. So again, if we think about anti-training, we're resisting going into extension, so we're training anti-extension, and resisting rotation, so we're training anti-rotation. Now, the spinal compressive force is somewhere in the vicinity just below 3,000 newtons for this exercise, depending on what variation you're doing, which compared to other back quote-unquote exercises such as Superman exercises, they can be up to 6,000 newtons or more, so relatively lower compared to other back exercises. Now, how to do it right? There are several different variations for all of these exercises, from beginner all the way up to advanced. And this is where it's probably most beneficial to see a McGill qualified practitioner to modify them to your individual needs, injury, and your requirements that you actually are looking for. And so it's not, again, a one size fits all. But when we're talking about the bird dog, what we do is we start on all fours, so on your hands and knees on the floor. And we like to start in a neutral position. So your spine is kept in that nice neutral position. So not too much flexion, not too much extension. And what I always like to cue patients with this one is to push the floor away with their hands. And that really helps to set your upper back and set you in a nice neutral position. Now with this one, again, you may add the core brace, which is by pushing your thumb muscles out to the side. But in some cases, we may not actually want to add that. So again, it's individualized. So what you start by doing is setting up in that nice neutral position, as we're saying, and then you're going to extend one arm and opposite leg. But the key with this is that you don't want to actually lift the arm or lift the leg. You actually want to push them out. So the arm's going to be pushed in front of you and the opposing leg is going to be pushed backwards. And the key here is we're focusing on hip extension. So you should focus on pushing back, not lifting the leg up. That's where a lot of people go wrong with this exercise. Okay. And we hold that exercise for somewhere 3 seconds, 5 seconds, up to 10 seconds sometimes, depending on the person. And the key here is to keep the spine as stable as possible. So when your arms are moving and they're out in that position, the spine isn't moving. It's completely still and stable. So again, we're not extending from the back, we're extending from the hip, and we're flexing from the shoulder. We also like to tell patients to squeeze their fist with the arm that's out in front. That helps to engage some of your back and shoulder muscles as well. And then you want to actually think about squeezing your lat or engaging your scapular muscles. That again recruits more of your back muscles or your posterior chain and helps to add more stability. Okay, so that's the very basic one, and then you'll come back in and go obviously to the opposite sides. Let's say you start off with your left arm and your right leg. You'll hold that for how many seconds, come back in, and then you go right arm, left leg. Now, there's various progressions for this one as well. You can do what we call a sweep, which is where you go out, come back in without touching back down, and go back out on the same side. This is a great way to challenge endurance. And then if you want to add a little bit more complexity and target a little bit more proprioception, we actually get patients to draw shapes with their arms and their legs, which, trust me, is quite tough. And I would encourage you to try it yourself. It's involving a lot of coordination and a lot of proprioception as well. Okay, so that's the bird dog to start off, one of the first of the big three. Next, we're moving on to the side plank, which is a great one for building lateral stability. Now, why it works so well is that it targets the obliques and the quadratus lumborum muscle in particular, which is a deep spinal muscle, and it prevents lateral flexion of the spine. But what I like about this one as well is it actually integrates the hip or the glute muscles. So we're getting them involved in helping to stabilize the spine and the lumbar spine in particular. Now, the compressive force of this one is around about 2,000 to 2,500 newtons, which compared to normal things like sit-ups, for example, which can exceed 3,000, 4,000, sometimes 5,000 newtons, depending on the way you're doing it. And the real beauty of this exercise lies in the fact that you're only activating half of your spinal musculature. Okay, so when you get into the side plank position, the bottom half is working and not the top half. Thus, you only have half the compressive force on the spine. And this is why this one's so good, because it's a great way of recruiting the muscles without overloading the spine. And I'll encourage you to test this yourself. If you get into a side plank position, feel your bottom sides, the one that's working, the one closest to the ground. You'll feel that rock hard, switched on. Those muscles are active. Feel the top half, and they're switched off. They're soft. They're not activated. And that's the beauty of this exercise, that we get such good muscle recruitment, but only half of the spine. So you really are reducing the cost or the load on the spine itself. So how to do this one? We start with our arm directly underneath our shoulder, knees slightly bent and hips slightly bent, lying on your side, obviously. And then from there, the key with this one is the way you get up. And we see a lot of patients do this incorrectly when they're doing the side plank. What you want to focus on is extending forward from your hips. So a lot of people will lift their back up and they laterally bend their spine to lift themselves up. Instead, what we're doing here is a hip hinge. So again, think about the key of these exercises. They teach great movement patterns, and one of them being the hip hinge in this position. So you're starting from a bent position, then you're hinging forward from your hips, and that's where you actually move. Extend forward from your hips, and that will raise you up instead of trying to lift your back up. So if you take basically a look from above or side on, you would see that once you get into that extended position, we should have a nice straight line from your head, shoulders, hips, knees, and then down to your feet if you're doing the full side plank on your feet. And again, we're thinking about training those beautiful movement patterns like the hip hinge coming from the ball and socket joint of the hip. Obviously, we're resisting lateral flexion. So again, anti-lateral flexion if you think about anti-movement training. And this one is a great one for working that plane of movement out to the side, right? So we've got our frontal plane, other ones are transverse and sagittal plane, but this one works that frontal plane very nicely, which is out to the side. And not a lot of exercises or movements we do target that plane. So it's a great one for targeting that. And like I said, it really recruits the glutes, which is a great one. Now, there's again a lot of variations that you can do for this one. I generally like to start on the knees for quite a few patients, particularly if they're lacking glute strength. It's a great way for recruiting a lot of glutes into it. And then you can lift that top leg up. So the one that's the highest up, lift that guy up, keep it nice and square with the hip. You can hold that there, and that's going to challenge that bottom glute a bit more, as well as working a little bit of that top glute in abduction. Great way to get those guys involved. And then you can actually go into the full on your feet, the full side plank position, and that's going to challenge a little bit more of that lateral core as you are increasing the distance between your base where you're touching the floor. So instead of being in the knees, now increased onto the feet. And then finally from there, the furthest progression is actually in that full side plank to lift that top leg and hold it there. Real challenge. Again, if you haven't tried this one, it'll be humbling. It's a real great one for building that frontal plane stability. Okay, moving nicely along onto the modified curl up, which is last of the big three. And this is really redefining your frontal core or abdominal exercises. Now, why it works so well is it engages the front core muscles, your rectus abdominis, as well as some of your obliques, while sparing the spine from excessive flexion. That's the key with this one. So spinal compressive forces, you're looking somewhere around 2,000 to 2,400 newtons, which is significantly lower than traditional sit-ups. So the major difference here that we see with this exercise is that the lumbar spine is not going into flexion. So in a normal sit-up or crunch, what you're doing is you're actually bending your spine and bringing your chest towards your knees, which flexes and rounds the lumbar spine. Now, the difference with the modified curl up is that there is actually no movement or no flexion of the lumbar spine. So it's a very small movement and people often overdo it. And all you're trying to do is basically lift your head and shoulders up off the floor, and then you're holding that position. So your lumbar spine isn't actually moving. Now, for those that have been following along for the podcast for a while, a big one to think about the spine is force on the spine. We try to keep it as low as possible, and force is mass times acceleration. So when your spine is going from a neutral position to a flex position, it's moving, right? So your movement or your acceleration increases, and therefore the load on the spine increases. And that's, again, the beauty of the modified curl up, is that doesn't happen. The lumbar spine is nice neutral position, and it's held there, so it's not moving, reduce the cost. Furthermore, the way we do the modified curl up also reduces the involvement of the hip flexors, and mainly the psoas in particular we're talking about, which reduces the compression force on the spine as the psoas muscle actually attaches directly onto the spine, right? So a normal setup where you have both legs bent up, or a crunch, or even a V-up or a leg raise, you're working a lot of that psoas hip flexor, which is fine if that's what you're targeting. But if you're trying to target your quote-unquote core, then perhaps those are not the best exercises, because they are working a lot more hip flexor than you think. Now, how to perform this one? You want to start by lying on your back. Okay. Now, again, specifying to your individual needs, but we like to start with one leg bent up, the other one straight down. Okay. And what it's going to do is help to keep the pelvis in neutral, because if you have both legs straight, your back will go into a little bit of extension initially. If you have both legs bent up, your back will go into a little bit of flexion. So one up, one down just helps to keep it in that neutral position. And then your hands go underneath the small of your back, not on the spine itself. This is key. Just in the small of the back muscles. And that the hands behind the lower back help to just maintain that neutral curve of the lumbar spine and ensuring that it doesn't move excessively. Okay. So from there, what we like to do is cue a core brace. So you're pushing your tongue muscles up, bracing correctly. And then you're going to lift your head and shoulders up at the same time. And you're going to hold for 5 seconds. Now, we only like to lift about 2 to 5 centimeters. A lot of people, coming from the background of normal crunches, really go too far. And that's where the lumbar spine can again go into flexion or movement. So we're just lifting up 2 centimeters, 5 centimeters. That's basically max. And the key with that one as well is you don't want to flex your neck. You want to keep your neck in a nice neutral position and focus on the shoulder blades lifting up off the floor. Then we want to hold there somewhere in the vicinity of 3 seconds, 5 seconds, up to 10 seconds, and then come back down. Now, it depends on the person, but sometimes you don't need to change the legs. So you can just have the one leg up the whole time. Other people like to swap them just because they like to keep it quote unquote even, as some of them describe. Or if it feels better on one side, we just tell patients to stick on one side. Now, there's a couple of progressions of this one. You can lift the leg as well, the leg that's straight. You can lift that guy up to recruit a little bit more of the hip flexors, if you want to progress it a little bit more. And then sometimes we'll even do the variation where we hold a weight so that you're doing what we call the can't get up, which is a variation of the modified curl up. But again, the key of this one is that we're not moving too high and we're resisting extension, right? So we're holding you up there and we're resisting gravity trying to pull us back down to extension. So we're resisting extension and also resisting a little bit of rotation as well. Okay, so how do these compare and why are these so good compared to other exercises? Well, most of your traditional core exercises focus on strength, but strength alone is not the answer. Okay, so we have a lot of patients that have really strong muscles, really strong, quote unquote, strong cores. But the key is that you need stability, endurance, and movement efficiency as well. And we always like to say that strength is a skill. Right? So you need the skill of the stability, you need the skill of the movement efficiency or proficiency as well. So how does the big three compare to traditional core exercises? Just to give you a little glimpse, a normal crunch or sit-up, you can have somewhere in the vicinity of 3,500 to 5,000 newtons, which is about, if we put that into kgs, divided by your 9.8, rounded to 10, so about 350 to 500 kgs of compressive force on the spine, right, which is quite significant. And it's quite funny because the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, they actually put a recommendation that a person under work conditions shouldn't be exposed to more than one incident or one occasion of 3,400 newtons. That's what they sort of capped it at. So they said that was the maximum exposure, once-off exposure that a person should be put under. Yet a crunch or sit-up exceeds that. Just one of them, right? And you can imagine how many people are there banging out crunches and core exercises. Again, context, not saying that they're terrible exercises. I'm just saying when it comes to the individual with lower back issues, there are better ones out there. Next, back exercises. So as I said a little bit before, the Superman, which is when you're lying face down on the floor, arms up in front of you, legs behind you, and then you lift your arms and legs up. That is about 6,000 newtons of compressive force, right? Huge amount. So 600 kgs, quite significant. Again, for uninjured, healthy spine, if you want to do that, hey, I'm not stopping you. But when the world that I work in, which is lower back rehabilitation and spinal issues, that's quite a significant cost, right? And you've got things like the reverse hyperextension. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about those and how they can be great for back. For the right person, brilliant. But for the wrong person, there's a significant amount of load that goes on with those ones. Then another common exercise, leg raises. What happens there is there's an overuse of the hip flexors, right? So as we said a little bit about the crunches initially, the hip flexors are really the ones doing the work there. And so what happens when you lift your legs up, so say you're hanging on a bar, doing leg raises, when people go into that position, they actually end up tucking their spine quite a bit as well, which puts the spine into spinal flexion. So again, it's under movement, which is going to increase the force that's on the spine there as well. And what you end up doing is actually training more of your hip flexors, which again, if that's what you're after, go for it. But when people think they're training their core and they actually end up training the hip flexors, that's where the problem comes. Now, as I reiterated previously, I'm going to do it again. The important part of the big three unlike these guys, is that they are retraining effective movement patterns, right? That's what we're doing. We're training the body to move more efficiently and spare the spine, which is so key and so important, why the big three are so great at what they do. And obviously they also have reduced compressive cost on the spine as well. So another tick in their column. Okay, so the takeaway from these guys, the real power of the big three is that these exercises aren't just about building a strong core. They're about rewiring the way you move. So they teach your body to generate power from the hips and shoulders while keeping the spine stable, exactly how you're designed to move. So if you struggle with back pain, or if you simply want to build a bulletproof core, the McGill Big Three should be a very vital part of your foundation. They're backed by science, proven in the field, and trusted by top athletes and clinicians worldwide. So here's my challenge to you. Go out, try the big three for even the next 2 weeks, see how you go with that. If you're doing these exercises, it will take you somewhere in the vicinity of about 5 to maybe 8 minutes, depending on what variations you're doing. And you'll see the benefit of these guys and actually see how they look simple, but simple doesn't mean easy, right? And they're brilliant in the way that they train your body. So see how you feel, see how your movement improves and how your back responds. And when you do, let me know, send me a message on our socials, leave a review or share your experiences, because I'm interested to see people out there if they do try it. But you'll see when you move better, you live better, right? So there's a great saying that we like to reiterate, that first move well and then move often, right? But we've got to move well first before we move often. So this is a great way to build those ones. So hopefully with this podcast, you got a bit of insightful information. It's not a relatively long one. I wanted to keep it a little bit shorter with this so you can get a nice quick takeaway from them. And like I said, the key with it is individualized and contextual to the individual person. Right, so I'm just giving you an overview of these guys, but understand why these become so popular is because they have been shown from lots of research and lots of good science that these are very effective at building core stability and training the way you move without compromising the spine, without loading the spine excessively more than we have to rehabilitate. And that's why we like the big three so much. So like I said, if you've got any questions, shoot them over to me, but hopefully you got a good amount of information from that. And as always, keep healthy, keep learning, and keep doing what you love.